Now for some analysis on a week that defies words here in Washington, we welcome our political panel. Dan Balz is the chief correspondent at The Washington Post. Rachael Bade covers Capitol Hill for Politico, and she's also a CNN political analyst. Mark Landler is a White House correspondent for the New York Times, and Ed O'Keefe is a political correspondent here at CBS News. Ed, let's start off with you. We had these midterm races Tuesday.
Right.
Do we have final results from some of these other races that are outstanding?
Well, first of all, welcome back. We're glad
Thanks.
to have you back in the building.
Congrats to you. You're new dad.
That's well, yes. But the answer to your question is no. There are still several unresolved races. We should start with the big one in Florida, of course, the Senate race, where Rick Scott maintains a 50% to 49.9% lead. But you can see there just about as many people that show up in a traffic jam in Miami separate these two from first and second place. Florida governor's race obviously still very tight. The Arizona Senate race, what was notable there, of course, is that the Democrat Kyrsten Sinema has pulled into the lead. You talk to Republicans in Arizona, they quietly concede. Sinema will probably hold on and win. And the Georgia governor's race, the goal of Democrat Stacey Abrams is to see if Brian Kemp gets below 50%, but in the ongoing recounts, he hasn't done that, so he may ultimately hold on there. A handful of House races have not yet been called. CBS and the other networks do it slightly differently than the Associated Press, so we're a little more cautious in when those calls are made. And as the speaker mentioned, or speaker-to-be, we presume, more than 30 seats will be picked up by Democrats, so she'll grow the size of her caucus. And notably, too, that we're going to have more than 100 women in the House, which I think really transforms the governing dynamic up on Capitol Hill and will make for a really interesting few years.
So that's where we are in terms of the numbers. But in terms of the opinions, some have very different views on where these races are, Dan. I mean, the president has weighed in, and you heard Senator Lindsey Graham also cast some doubt on what's happening in Florida and the integrity of that election there.
Yeah, the president weighed in and basically accused Democrats of trying to steal both the elections in Florida and in Arizona without any evidence of theft or fraud. There are problems in some of the counties in Florida, which is unfortunately not a new situation in Florida. And those of us who covered the 2000 recount remember all of the problems down there, and some of those have not been solved. But there is counting often goes slowly, and it takes sometimes days and weeks in some states to actually get a final vote on these elections. And there's a process underway. It will be closely watched at this point. The opportunity for fraud will probably be quite minimal at this point, given all of the attention that's going on. But the president, by doing that, undermines faith in the basic process of our democracy. And it would be better, obviously, if people in positions of power let the process play out. There are a lot of people who think that the Republicans likely will hold on to both of those tight races in Florida. They are ahead narrowly, but they may have enough votes to be able to hold on. People should simply wait.
Rachel, biggest Democrat gain in the House since 1974, and more women than we have ever seen winning elected office for this new Congress. Right. Given this environment, does that change much?
We'll have to see. I mean, I think that Republicans know that they have bled in the suburbs. Republican leadership, they were encouraging the president before the election to sort of tone down a lot of this heated rhetoric. He did not, and they paid a price for it. The question here is, do Republicans learn from it going forward? And the president, in terms of looking at 2020, I think he thinks his own reelection is better if he continues that rhetoric, which is a different sort of election than House Republicans would need to retake the House. In terms of in terms of women coming to Washington, I can tell you that on Capitol Hill, there's already discussions about changing the campus to make sure they can accommodate all these women and make sure that it's a friendly work environment for mothers. There's new baby changing tables and bathrooms for lawmakers, and there's talk about nursing stations around the Capitol. But again, policy changes. You saw Pelosi talk about health care, making that a key issue next year, and I think that would be smart for them, especially because Republicans sort of tried to deflect a lot of attacks on health care by saying we do care about pre-existing conditions when in fact they tried to repeal Obamacare.
Sliding in the suburbs, I think, is how Leader McConnell put it in terms of a problem for the GOP. But Mark, for the president, as Rachel just said, does this necessarily cause a change in tone, a change in behavior for him? Because certainly after Tuesday, he seemed as combative as ever.
If anything, more combative. I mean, he came out and made this rather hapless effort to claim victory. And then when it became clear over the ensuing days that really he had taken a stinging setback in the House, you saw his mood sort of deteriorate through the week. And as Rachel said, and Dan, he went after the electoral process in Florida. He went after the press. He went after the rule of law, in a sense, in putting Matt Whitaker into a job in the Justice Department on an acting basis that many people have profound problems with. So you really saw him shift to an aggressive stance on almost across the board. There are issues where the president has said he could work with the Democratic House, infrastructure being one, potentially immigration. But the big question that I would have is the president going to be capable of compartmentalizing potentially productive work on the legislative side with an unrelenting round of investigations that he now faces in a Democrat-controlled House? I think that's emotionally going to be very difficult for him, and he already made clear in the past week that if the Democrats really investigate him aggressively, he will respond in a warlike way. He will try to investigate them. So it's sort of difficult from where we sit based on watching his demeanor over the past 3 days to see how he shifts to a more cooperative, collaborative stance. It feels like we're in for more and more partisan combat.
And what should we expect in terms of cabinet member departures? Jeff Sessions, that was telegraphed for months.
I think the big one to watch out for is Jim Mattis, the defense secretary. You may recall the interview where the president said, well, Jim Mattis is basically a Democrat. So the question is, does Jim Mattis really take this as a cue to either leave on his own steam, or will the president now put pressure on him? John Kelly, the chief of staff, is another person to watch. The president, or John Kelly rather, has said that he's been asked to stay through 2020. We'll see whether that really happens. There's evidence his wings have already been clipped within the White House. But I think the really consequential one is Mattis, and that's one that would have really a profound effect in foreign perceptions of the United States and in the foreign policy and the national security of this administration for its last 2 years of the first term.
Ed, how does that environment that we just heard described shape up for the president? I mean, you've had already a number of the Democrats who expect to be in leadership positions in the new Congress say they're readying subpoenas.
Right. And I think actually, while we watch the dynamics among the president and his staff, one of the more interesting subplots in Washington over the next few months at least certainly will be bringing in that new wave of Democrats, many of whom were elected on the idea that they want to come here and serve as a check on the president. A lot of younger people who were inspired to run because of him and their opposition to him, and how they run into a leadership class led by, at least for now, Nancy Pelosi, and older committee chairmen and chairwomen who will want to do a lot of this work, but aren't necessarily going to want to go as far as a lot of base Democratic voters across the country want them to go. Jerry Nadler, the House Judiciary Committee chairman, reiterated again this morning, as has Speaker presumed Pelosi, that they will only go into impeachment if the evidence is overwhelming and if there is bipartisan support for doing so. That is a high bar,
yes.
Both of those. And I think that could create some early conflict among Democrats. But you'll see them go after things like what was going on at the EPA when Scott Pruitt was there. Why does the Secret Service have to pay money at Trump Tower and Mar-a-Lago and all these other places? And try to go after the president's tax returns. And each one of those has the potential to really upset him.
Right. Still Republican-controlled Senate as a backstop for that. But we have more to talk about in a moment with our panel, so stay with us. We're back with our panel of journalists, and we want to discuss some explosive exchanges this week between the president and members of the White House press corps.
That's enough. Pardon me, ma'am. Excuse me. That's enough. I'm not responding. I'm responding to. Excuse me. I'm not responding to you. I'm talking to this gentleman. Will you please sit down? Excuse me. Excuse me, would you please sit down? Please go ahead.
On the campaign trail, you called yourself a nationalist. Some people saw that as emboldening white nationalists. Now people are also saying
I don't know why you'd
that
say
the
that.
president.
It's such a racist
There are
question.
some people.
Do you want him to bring in Robert Mueller?
What a stupid question that is. What a stupid question. But I watch you a lot. You ask a lot of stupid questions.
Was the president there speaking about Abby Phillips of CNN, who is a very smart journalist. You also heard Jim Acosta of CNN, April Ryan of American Urban Radio Networks, Yamiche Alcindor of PBS, all getting real fire from the president. Mark, what's happening here? I mean, the president always seems to be combative with the press, but to many, this seems a new level of aggression.
Yeah, I think that the midterm election and the setback he suffered there has maybe changed his psychological frame, and not for the better. We were used to this kind of a vexed relationship. We've had it with him from the start. But what you saw this past week was really of a very different order. Stripping the credential of the CNN correspondent Jim Acosta, that's something that no recent president in memory has tried to do. And the attacks, the verbal attacks on April Ryan, Abby Phillip, and Yamiche Alcindor are particularly, I think, problematic because the three of them are African-American women. For him to say to Yamiche, a former colleague of mine, that asking him a very valid question about his inflammatory rhetoric is somehow a racist question, I think really is at some level beyond the pale. Likewise with Abby, she asked an absolutely valid question about the future of the Mueller investigation under a new leadership at the Department of Justice. And April Ryan, who, by the way, wasn't even present for the session where he simply went after her, presumably because she had tried to ask him a question at his press conference earlier in the week. These are all professional women doing their jobs the right way, and for him to single them out and be so ad hominem, I think is a new level for those of us in the press corps that have been used to this. I think we're all a little bit stunned by what we saw this past week.
And Dan, there is a lot to be said in parsing this, and that the media shouldn't be talking about itself as much as we have been in terms of this aggressive line with the president. But tell us why this matters in the broader political sense. You did have some journalist organizations come out and even criticize the phrasing of questions from fellow journalists. Is there a policing of the Fourth Estate that needs to be done, or is this in any way acceptable, this kind of language?
Well, there's always self-reflection that needs to be done by those of us in the press. I mean, I think we all have to constantly think about what's the best way to do our job, particularly in a very difficult environment. And I think every news organization and every reporter who covers stories like this does ask those questions. But that begs the issue of what the president has done, not just this week. And I agree with Mark. This was another, several levers up in his attacks on the press. But he has done it consistently, and it is strategic on his part, because it is designed to undermine the validity of a free press. And secondly, we know that it inflames his base supporters. I mean, I think everybody around this table gets emails from people who are very loyal to Donald Trump, who in fact believe that we take it as our job to try to undermine him. That is not the case. We hold people in power accountable, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. We can be tough on presidents, and we often are, and presidents don't particularly like that. But most presidents, or all previous presidents, have reacted differently than President Trump has. And I think that's the issue. And as Mark said, particularly the attacks on 3 African-American female correspondents, all of whom are professional in the way they approach their job, is another aspect of this that is even different from simply attacks on the press.
Well, and he's taken on 2 Latino correspondents as well, Cecilia Vega, the previous one, and Jim Acosta. And, for some of us, that isn't coincidence. And I think that's part of what is so troubling. But, one thing we need to point out with this president, like him or hate him, the press corps sees him and gets to question him more often than we did George W. Bush and Barack Obama.
That's a very good point. Yeah, very good point.
Rachel, just button us up here quickly. I mean, for those who say we're being overly sensitive, that there's nothing racist in what the president did, there was a lot of these nationalist tones, so to speak, that were rewarded on the campaign trail, were they not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that race right now is one of those topics that Republicans, it's hurting them right now when they hear and they're following the president. They're trying to distance themselves from the president, but this keeps coming back and hurting them on the campaign trail. I mean, I'm thought of Steve King and some of the rhetoric that has come out of his mouth, and it sort of divided the Republican leadership about whether or not to back him or just not say anything. And we actually saw one Republican leader, the NRCC chairman, Steve Steve Stivers come out and say, listen, this kind of rhetoric is not acceptable, and we have to stand up against it. Notably, no other House Republican leaders did that.
And he was resilient.
Yeah, and he was reelected.
Well, we have so much to digest from this week, I think all of us, by the end of it. We're going to be right back here on Face the Nation. Stay with us.